The implementation, that's the real tricky stuff, because it's not just following a list of guides or a recipe book. It's getting and tapping into human psychology. It's getting into what makes people do things, what kind of traps people fall in, and what the other influences are on whether someone can actually maintain a healthy lifestyle.
So what are the healthiest foods that people should eat on a daily basis to help them lose weight and balance their blood sugar?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I think everyone is coming around to this idea of sugar balance and ensuring that we don't have glucose spikes and the corresponding glucose crashes. And so I think the interest in this subject is definitely warranted as it relates to losing weight, as well as most people in the UK and the US need to do. Unfortunately, we have a huge obesity crisis. We're the fattest nation in Europe,
Wow.
officially in the UK, running behind the US, I will point out, but still an issue. And when I talk about food, I think what trumps everything is composition quality. So, there are a number of different scoring systems now to determine how processed a food is. There's a Nova scoring system. There's a few others that we've got here in the UK. And I think the first thing you need to determine before you put anything in your mouth is this a whole food or not? Is this a food that is found most likely in nature, untouched, minimally processed? That's really what we want to be thinking about, because I could tell you a whole list of different ingredients and different categories of ingredients, but in reality, what you need to focus on is the processing, because most of the ingredients that we come across in a supermarket are not whole food ingredients, as you know. They're mostly processed. And so whatever I say today, I'm going to give you a few categories and a few ingredients. That is the number one thing I want people to take away. Think about how processed an ingredient is. Typically, something that you can recognize, something that there's a saying around grandparents, if your grandparents could recognize this and cook with it, then it's probably something safe to eat. I think that's probably a good litmus test. But if there's one thing I want people to take away, it's beware of processed foods, minimize that to the maximum, and that's what will improve your blood sugar regulation and improve your ability to maintain good weight for you.
And what is the mechanism there? Like, I feel like everybody seems to be talking about like processed foods this, processed foods that, but like, how does it actually work from a biological standpoint?
Yeah, so there's two main things, I think. So when you disrupt the food matrix itself, you essentially change the way by which those nutrients can be absorbed into your body. So when you change, let's say, a carbohydrate like a bean, for example, or let's say whole wheat, for example, into something that is much, much more refined, not only are you stripping away a lot of the nutrients that you find in the whole food, but you're also changing the way in which your body hyper-absorbs that. Oops.
there goes my backpack.
It's your bag.
It's all good. It's all good. Yeah. That's the power of the information that you are delivering. Yeah. There's like seismic power in it.
I'm forcibly like moving, changing minds.
I love it.
Where was I? So yeah, you change the speed at which your body can absorb those nutrients. So in the form of carbohydrates, the more processing it is, the quicker that you're going to absorb the sugars, the quicker that's going to turn into glucose into your bloodstream, and you're going to cause this corresponding spike before your body gets a chance to respond to it appropriately with insulin and other processing. So that's one way in which it changes. The other thing, like I alluded to earlier, is that you're stripping away a lot of the nutrients as well. The B vitamins that you find in whole grains, for example, the different types of fibers are taken away. So that's something that's going to change, will remove the beneficial compounds that you find in whole foods. And the other thing is what we're adding to processed foods to make them hyper palatable. So things like refined oils, things like sugars as well that are packaged into that food to make it wholesome. Those are things that your body isn't used to consuming. And there's a whole bunch of other chemicals as well that we use in processed foods just to maintain shelf life. And look, I don't want to rag too much on the food industry because I think it's quite easy to, first off, but what they've been tasked with is essentially creating foods that are easily transportable, very cheap, and hyper palatable. And actually, that as a task, they did pretty damn well. The fact that we can eat in food deserts, the fact that I can drive up to Birmingham, which is for your American listeners around 200 miles away, and stop in the middle of the motorway and actually find something to eat. The reason why we have processed foods was mainly for that reason.
Yeah.
So we can travel between cities and not have to rely on those different elements. But at that, there is a lot of cost associated with that as well. And the fact that they are hyperpalatable, the fact that they are over-marketed, the fact that they genuinely target the most poor and the most vulnerable in society. This is why we do have a disparity in health outcomes as well. So, with those elements of processed foods, that's kind of why we need to be very, very careful about them as well. So, every now and then have a snack, indulge in something, but this shouldn't be the staple of your diet as is currently being promoted by a lot of these companies.
Yeah, I mean, you can't really fault food manufacturers, right? Like if I was in that business, I would want my products to be cheap.
Yeah.
I would want them to be delicious, right?
Yeah.
To create repeat customers. I would want them to be safe. I would want them to have all the characteristics that we ascribe to ultra processed foods today.
Yeah, absolutely.
They're not done with malicious intent.
Yeah.
They're not created with the intent of driving obesity and non-communicable chronic disease. But the problem, I think, which you so eloquently alluded to, is that we tend to overconsume them today, and that's the primary issue.
And it's very easy too. There's the bliss point that they spend millions of dollars and pounds in research and developing, to get to that point where it does become something that you absolutely love. But there is a downside to that, and most people struggle to find the balance of overeating and using just as a sort of luxury rather than a staple in one's diet. There is. Obviously, when you think about it's funny you said the word malicious, and I think it's quite easy just to think that they are doing this because they want everyone to have type 2 diabetes. They want everyone to, increase their health costs to the country. I don't believe that, but there's definitely looking the other way of these food manufacturers. When you explain to them what's going on, there's a lot of lobbying to fight the other corner, unfortunately. So yeah, there's definitely looking on the other way, but I think they can definitely do a better job.
In the U.S., there's now data that suggests that 73% of the U.S. food supply is ultra processed. 73% of the products found in your average supermarket, actually more accurately, are ultra processed, like fit that categorization.
Yeah.
Is that similar over here?
I would say it's probably the same. And it's funny when I talk about processed foods to people, most people imagine the sort of garish cartoon laden products, cereal boxes, there's bars and all that kind of stuff. Actually, a lot of healthy foods, quote unquote healthy foods, like healthy bars and energy balls and all this stuff that has been, painted with a sort of natural look, dark green, mahogany, all those kind of color palettes, are pretty unhealthy as well. Because if you think about the processing that's involved in those products, you're stripping away a lot of the natural fibers, you're combining it with a whole bunch of gels, you're adding other additives that make it more shelf stable, you're putting it in, you're essentially putting it in a package to make it transportable. So a lot of these processing categories actually apply to quote unquote healthful foods as well. So you've got to be pretty careful. And what I'm trying to help people develop is a health reflex. So when you look at a product on a store shelf, when you are in a convenience store, wherever you might be, you have a general inclination to not just grab the item based on the claims on the front of it. You actually turn it over and you read the back of the ingredients and you try and determine for yourself, is this something that I want to eat today? Or is this something that I'm going to put back and then opt for something else that's a lot more wholesome?
Brilliant. Are there many other doctors that think like you in the UK?
I think when I started out 6 years ago, I was probably one of the very few. I know you've spoken to Rungan, for example. There's A.M. Panja. There's a bunch of us that have been talking about this for a little while, but it's definitely becoming a lot more popular today. And one of the things that I wanted to do actually quite early in my career is actually educate a lot more, not just doctors, but other allied health professionals about the beauty of food and the medicinal effects of eating well. And so one thing that I borrowed from the States was a culinary medicine course that is currently being taught at Tulane Medical School. I believe Harvard Med School and Columbia also had a culinary medicine module in the early 2000s as well. And what we did as a nonprofit is start teaching medical students as part of their electives. So during their medical school, they have 2 to 3 weeks where they do a specialty subject. Some of them do neurosurgery, some of them do plastics, some of them do immunology. And we actually put culinary medicine as a module where we taught them the basics of cooking for themselves, but also how you empower patients to eat well and develop these sort of health reflexes as well. So one of the things that I think I'm really proud of is actually being involved in this nonprofit and teaching over 1,000 plus health professionals how they can start having these conversations. And obviously that's sort of, it's grown over the last few years. So yeah, I think there's definitely to answer your question more directly, I think there's definitely a growing number of medical professionals in the UK, but still much smaller than it should be.
This episode of the show is sponsored by House of Macadamias. I'm a huge fan of macadamia nuts, but they've always been cost prohibitive. They've always been the most premium and expensive nut. That's why I'm super glad that House of Macadamias is now making macadamia nuts easily accessible to all. They've partnered with farmers in South Africa to democratize macadamia nuts, making macadamia nuts finally affordable. Macadamias are incredible. They're super high in healthy monounsaturated fat. They are vegan, keto, and paleo approved. And House of Macadamias makes all kinds of macadamia-based products. You can get dry roasted macadamias, which are my personal favorite. They come in a myriad of different flavors, like zesty salsa flavor. They are 10 out of 10 delicious. And if you go to houseofmacadamias.com and use promo code MAX, you'll get 20% off of your order. Thank you so much, House of Macadamias, for sponsoring this episode of the show. Do you get pushback?
Yeah, man.
Tell me about that.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think we've chatted about this in the past. For sure, man. Like, whenever you're putting your head above the parapet, so to speak, you're always going to get shot down. This doctor doesn't know what he's talking about. He hasn't got a nutrition degree. He's trying to replace nutritionists and dietitians. He's promoting eating unhealthy eating habits that can lead to eating disorders. Whatever sort of angle you want, I kind of had it. And I think one of the things that I'm really grateful for are those experiences, because it makes you a lot more resilient. It makes you a lot more refined with the evidence base. The references I put in my first and second book, for example, are in the hundreds. I've now got on to do my master's in nutritional medicine, alongside a whole bunch of other people, from general practice to ITU to anesthetists as well. So there is this sort of conversation, and for all the put downs, I think, when I look back over the last few years, I've kind of come around the other side relatively unscathed and stronger for it. So, for anyone that's having a moment where they're feeling like they're alone, or they're having sort of a second guess moment where they're like, am I really right? Or is this the right thing to do? Or everyone's calling me out and that kind of stuff. Like, you just got to believe in yourself. And if you strongly believe in your truth, then you just got to lay it all out there.
Yeah, as long as your values are in the right place.
Yeah, and I think you also got to be willing to be wrong, right? So, some of the things that I might have changed my opinion on over the last couple of years include things like, the value of LDL-C and ApoB containing lipoproteins, for example. I think I would have swayed towards it not being as important as I now believe it to be. And that's, in light of speaking to lipidologists and listening to other preventative cardiologists, for example. I've become probably more bullish on things like glucose hacks and actually the importance of maintaining good balanced glucose levels using things like continuous glucose monitors. I would have thought that might have been something that was outside the realm of attainability for most people, and perhaps it wasn't something that was necessary. Actually, I think I'm subscribing to this idea of what gets measured gets managed. And actually, for certain people, having that amount of information is actually quite a motivational thing. Is actually something that can push people toward better behaviors. And so, I'm willing to be wrong. I'm willing to sort of like lay it out there and say, you know what, I've actually changed my opinion on this. But broadly speaking, the sort of themes that have come out of me, doing the research and looking at nutrition studies for the last 10, 15 years and having my own personal experiences with my own health and my patients' health, I wouldn't say there's much that I've changed my mind on, but I'm certainly willing to be educated. That as long as there are scientists in the world that are doing some great stuff in the lab and beyond.
Yeah, I love it. I mean, it's just that the vitriol that you sometimes get in the online nutrition space, I just feel like it makes, at the end of the day, whether a person is right or wrong, if you get the sense that their values are aligned and they're doing it from a place of like authentic empathy and care, then like why attack? It's okay to call people to like DM people and be like, hey, you might want to check this reference or check your wording on that. Maybe it's getting a little bit ahead of the science. But the culture online now is such that it's like this call out culture.
Yeah. I call it outrage culture. Like we it's almost like we want to be outraged. It's almost like we surf the internet, using a 90s term there, to sort of like look for things that could trigger us. And I think, we do have a human negativity bias. I get that.
Yeah.
But sometimes I think this sort of culture of public shaming is well out of whack. And actually, when you think about why you're doing the calling out or whatever it might be, it's probably more so narcissistic than it is a public service, which is sort of like the virtue signaling fence that people put around as to why they do that in the first place.
Yeah, it's not coming from... See, I don't believe that it's coming from a place of, I'm just doing this out of virtue so that I can help people separate fact from fiction and see the truth of new... I think it's actually just another form of clout chasing.
Yeah.
And they've realized, that the algorithm tends to favor that kind of content.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And you see it from both sides, right? Like you would purposely put something out that's going to be controversial. It's going to rub certain people up the wrong way because that increases engagement and increases the number of comments you're going to put out there. It's funny, I was chatting to Johan Hari on the podcast.
Sapiens?
No. That's Yuval Hari. Johan Hari, he did Chasing the Scream, that was turned into like a Netflix documentary with Samuel L. Jackson doing the narration on it. And his latest book is called Stolen Focus. He's also been on Steve Bartlett's Diary of a CEO as well. Really, really good podcast. Very, very good communicator. And his book, Stolen Focus, is all about technology and how these social media companies have sort of trended towards those sort of like shouty sort of figures, and actually because they know that's what's going to get more people on, that's going to get more engagement, you're going to get more daily active users, and that's why they're trending towards that as the algorithm. And so his sort of analysis of tech sort of explains a lot of what we see in nutrition culture online and on social media, right? We're basically all being trained to be as loud and as vitriolic as possible and as controversial as possible.
So screwed up.
It is kind of screwed up. And I see it like, this is something that I've been doing a lot of soul searching on myself because, I've done like 5 books now. The app came out. I'm doing the culinary medicine non-profit thing as well. I do talks and, as you do as well, with the podcast, like having tons of downloads. But at the same time, it's at a backdrop of where people have never been unhealthier, right? We have rising rates of cancer, type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, dementia obviously is on the rise. You have this huge sort of health inequality that's deepening as well as a result of cost of living crisis and inequalities within finances. And what I'm really obsessed with trying to create is impact. I've been a medical doctor for like 15 years. One of the reasons why I'm now transitioning into doing Doctor's Kitchen full time is because I feel like I want to be able to scale the impact I can in preventative medicine. And the only way I'm going to do that is if I double down on this rather than seeing one patient at a time, right? It's just not an efficient way of trying to get the message out there. And I'm with everything I've done thus far, yes, I could qualify that I've done a better job than I could do if I was seeing patients one-on-one in a general practice setting. But am I having a massive uh, nationwide impact or global impact? I don't know. I can't think. I don't think I can qualify that right now. And so that's why I started the tech company, because tech has this incredible ability to, as we've just discussed, have a massive positive and negative effect. And I feel that the implementation of all the stuff that we talk about, the science, the nutrition, the healthy behavior change, all that kind of stuff, that can be magnified with the right digital product. So yeah, that's a bit of a tangent into sort of how I'm feeling about tech and this position that I'm in, where I've got a bit of influence and I just want to have the biggest scaled impact as possible.
Of course, yeah. Well, and you're having a massive impact already. So I'm excited to see where you go from here.
Yeah, yeah.
It's just incredible. For people though that are like, feeling overwhelmed, because I feel like one of the issues with just calling out my own industry, the wellness industry, is that at times it can seem very overwhelming for your average person, right? Like, avoid all the endocrine disrupting chemicals in your environment, avoid the ultra processed foods. You got to sleep 9 hours a day, or you're doing something wrong. Or where should somebody like begin who's feeling overwhelmed, feeling a bit sort of lost within this space?
Yeah.
Like how do you like triage your approach for somebody who's like kind of naive to all this?
Yeah, I have this saying that I remind everyone about, and it's the science is complex, the solutions are simple, like, sleep 9 hours a day, eat this, don't eat that. Implementation, that's the hard stuff, right? So like, we love to nerd out on all the stuff around the microbiota, your gut-brain connection and anti-inflammatory chemicals and EDCs and all the rest of it. That's all the science stuff. The solutions, it sounds really simple, right? I remember when I was a young general practitioner around 10 years ago or so, I remember thinking to myself, I just lay out the information to my patients and then they'll just get it. Like, if I tell them to eat these nuts and these greens and, have this kind of meat and less of that kind of meat, they'll just do it. No, that's not what happens at all. The implementation, that's the real tricky stuff, because it's not just following a list of guides or, a recipe book. It's getting and tapping into human psychology. It's getting into what makes people do things, what kind of traps people fall in, and what the other influences are on whether someone can actually maintain a healthy lifestyle. Is it finances? Is it stress? Is it trauma? Is it something to do with their education? All these different really, really varied things that can impact on whether someone actually is able to maintain a healthy lifestyle or not. So that's kind of like the way I kind of frame it to people. And if there's anything that we've learned from human behavior psychologists and people like BJ Fogg, for example, and his Tiny Habits sort of lectures from Stanford and the book as well, it's you've got to start really, really small. For most people, you have to start very, very small and then build and stack your habits on top of each other. And so the one thing that I did my TED Talk on was just a saying, just add one more. Can you add just one more fruit, vegetable, nut, or seed at every mealtime? Just one more. If you're having cereal, let's say, even if it's a ultra processed cereal that you have in the mornings, can you add nuts or seeds to that? If you're having a sandwich, we have something in the UK. It's meal deals. I don't know if you guys have that in the States.
What is that?
A meal deal is like it's almost like the darling of like the sort of white collar worker in cities across the UK. It's like a sandwich, a bag of crisps, which is what you guys call chips, and like a can of Coke. And a meal deal is like amazing because you get all that for like less than £4 or something.
It's like a combo meal, value meal.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's a combo meal. It's probably not as bad as some of the junk food options that you guys have in the States. But, let's say even if you're having a meal deal, can you add like a piece of fruit to that, at dinner time, can you make a side of greens? And I know it doesn't sound like it would make any difference whatsoever, but it really does. Out of the thousands of patients that I've seen throughout my medical career, starting small with people rather than giving them a real sort of mammoth task to do from day one, that leads to consistency. If there's anything, the second thing I would want to emphasize to your listeners, if there's anything that really moves the needle, it is all about consistency. And one of the things that really painted this picture for me was the A to Z study by Professor Gardner from Stanford, I believe it was. And what they found is they put people on seemingly very different diets. They had a vegan diet, a low-fat diet, med diet, paleo diet, and they followed them up for a year, quite a long study. And what they found was that all of the participants lost weight. The biggest factor, and they used weight as an endpoint, BMI, I know it's got loads of issues with, but let's just put that to a side and just assume that loss of weight is generally going to be a good thing. Most people need to lose weight anyway. And what they found was that the biggest contributor to whether someone was successful in the diet or not was purely, or successful on the losing weight or not, was purely how likely they were to consistently keep that diet. So whether you choose to go on a fully plant-based diet or a Mediterranean diet or even a paleo diet, it doesn't really matter to me. I'm kind of cognitively I'm sort of separating my own sort of biases away from those diets. Whatever works for that person in front of me, works for them, that's great. That's got to be a lot better than the standard American diet or the standard English diet or whatever sort of ultra-processed junk food diet most people subscribe to today. So, for me, I think it's all about consistency, starting really, really small, and just acknowledging the fact that implementation of all this stuff that we talk about and we sort of inadvertently paint a picture of as being quite simple is actually quite hard to do.
It's quite hard to do, but the impact is massive. I love the concept of like add one more, right? Because it's compounding interest.
Yeah,
it's so easy to wrap your head around doing one more thing every day, or do it 1% better, right? Like do like 1% better today. Be 1% better today than you were yesterday. But if you're 1% better the next day, and then 1% better the next day, then after a year, who knows where you're gonna find yourself?
Absolutely. And I've got an example of I don't think I've talked about this particular case before, but I had an IBD patient who was relatively well controlled and some immunologics. And for those of you who don't know, inflammatory bowel disease, there's two different types. Generally, most people would respond to a high fiber diet, as well as all the other drugs that we do to suppress the immune system, as it's an autoimmune condition. And this particular gentleman came, and I think he was in his mid 40s when he saw me. And I remember asking him about diet, and I remember him sort of like raising his eyebrows and thinking, this is the first time anyone's asked me about my diet. And he'd been seen by other GPs, other sort of A&E consultants when he went in for flare-ups, unfortunately, which is something that can happen, and gastroenterologists as well. And I remember just dissecting his diet, and his diet was pretty horrific. And I don't mean to be judgmental about people's diets here, but McDonald's featured on it pretty regularly. And a lot of ultra high processed, very convenient foods that we tend to have in the morning, so breakfast cereals and all the rest of it. And I started thinking around this consistency piece for this particular person, and around the time I'd started changing my tact as to how I deliver this information and give people essentially very, very simple guides to maintain. And we started very, very small. I said, look, can you swap out one of your breakfasts once a week for this instead? It was just like some oats, some pumpkin seeds, something he could make the night before. And I remember over the course of around 6 to 8 months, we completely changed his diet, where he was still having the odd junk food meal because he was working on the road, and there's not many places where you can actually get a decent meal unless you're really prepared and you make yourself your lunch the day before. But this person had really massively increased their fiber content, lost weight, inflammatory markers came down, flares came right down as well. And actually his gastroenterologist who we were seeing actually reduced the dose of some of his medications.
Wow.
So, this isn't to sort of like be sniffed at. Even like changing someone's processed food diet to something that is less processed, has a demonstrable impact as well. And
Hmm.
it's those like, little anecdotes that just give me a little bit more sort of confidence that these are the sorts of messages we need to be exploring. These are the sorts of messages that we need to be promoting to people, because those little changes can be really powerful, as you said.
Yeah, and you're not saying that you can't eat your favorite ultra processed snack
Yeah.
or confectionery product or even sugar sweetened beverage ever again.
Yeah.
You're not saying that. You're just saying to like cut it down. I mean, if you do any better than the norm, which
Yeah.
today on average is like 60% of the calories that your average person consumes comes from these like kinds of like vending machine foods, essentially. If you do any better than that, I mean, you're going to see better health than the average.
Absolutely, yeah. And it's funny. I always get like sort of funny looks whenever I talk to people about my like dirty secrets, and not really dirty secrets, but my sort of like pleasures when it comes to food. Like, I'm a big foodie, right? Like, I cook for a living, and the reason why I've sort of developed a niche for healthy cooking is because I put like a flavor spin on it. I'm trying to like inject like color and cultural heritage into the recipes that I create, because eating should be fun. It's like one of the direct routes to pleasure. There's a reason why our dopamine system lights up with sugar, for example, or when we see something delicious on a plate, and we can put a healthy spin on that as well.
Hmm.
And so, I think actually part of a healthy lifestyle has some junk food in it, has a bit of those sort of like luxury items that we use as a luxury rather than something that is enjoyed on a daily or like, a couple of times a week basis. I mean, I don't mean to sound puritanical, and that's why, I always want to emphasize the fact that every now and then I am going to have like a warm jam donut with like the jam oozing out of it and all the rest of it. But am I going to have that like once a week or even once a day? No, I'm probably not going to have that once a day. I'm going to enjoy it though when I do.
Love it. Love it. Balance. Yeah, it's so important. Are there any vegetables in particular that you think people should be eating or striving to eat on a daily basis, and why?
Yeah. So, we were talking about processed food at the start, weren't we? So, I mean, I'm obviously a big fan of cruciferous vegetables, greens. It has a wide plethora of all these different phytochemicals, these plant chemicals that we know have a great impact on the brain, have an awesome impact on inflammation levels, can even potentially reduce LDL-C and ApoB lipoprotein containing sorry, I'm going to say that again, ApoB particles. And I have a saying, which is like greens at every meal if possible, So we will have like cavallonero, which is also known as Tuscan kale or black kale, for example. We'll have rocket, or you guys call arugula. The way you can tell this is actually going to be a beneficial brassica ingredient is the bitter notes. And we've actually kind of lost the appreciation for bitter vegetables in our diet. We tend to go for the more sweet ones, and actually they're kind of being selectively bred out. Like a banana, for example, shouldn't really be as sweet as it is today. It's actually quite bitter. And if you think about like a plantain, generally like, which is a lot bigger and green, it has a real distinct bitter flavor to it that's probably closer to what a banana would have been. So greens are something that I'd always like put into our daily diet, and just trying to get it in every opportunity as possible. Some of those phytochemicals like indo-3-carbinol, for example, or those glucosinolates, those have been studied in lab environments, but also in human populations. And the more greens you have in terms of portions per day, the better your health outcomes across the board, let alone brain and cardiovascular outcomes. So absolutely, I would definitely get more greens in your diet as possible.
It's amazing. Yeah, you're right. It's like greens are, in a way, the last vestige of like the ancient world, and all of the chemicals and phytonutrients that came with those plants.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because like fruits are there was like something in fruits, right? Like sugar.
Yeah.
That humans, in all of their industrious, creative brilliance, right, decided, okay, well, if we breed these a certain way, we can magnify this palatable aspect of fruit, right? And make them available 365 days a year anywhere in the world, right? But like greens are, yeah, you're right. There were probably some that were more bitter than others.
Yeah.
But
I mean, definitely like the ones, because they're perennial vegetables, right? So we can grow them particularly in the UK anyway, we can grow them most times throughout the whole year. The ones I usually veer towards are the as bitter as possible. So things like watercress, for example, that grows like all over in the UK. And across Europe, we have all different types of species of kale as well. There are some concerns around things like oxalate levels, or even some of the pesticides that you find on these vegetables because they tend to be sprayed. We have less of an issue of that in the UK, and the soil quality, for example. But I think, and the other thing is, if you're eating a lot of these vegetables, there is a particular concern around goitrogens and the impact on your thyroid gland.
Particularly of raw, right? If you're
Raw,
consuming it
yeah.
raw.
But I remember looking into this, and I spoke to some urologists on the podcast who work at the Metabolic Center in London. So they're specifically looking at people who precipitate renal calculi, kidney stones, to the nth degree. Like these guys have got a metabolic issue where they don't process oxalates and other chemicals properly, such that they have recurrent stones. And unless you're eating tons of raw greens every single day, it's very unlikely that you're going to get to those very high levels where you're going to have this goitrogenic effect that's going to impact your thyroid. That's the first thing. And the other thing is, actually, the oxalate levels in greens that you consume don't really tend to lead to that renal calculi precipitating effect in your kidneys either. A lot of the bugs that actually created, so the microbes in your large intestine, as a result of a diverse diet, will actually break down the oxalates themselves and actually excrete them. So I don't think it's as much of a concern as a few people are talking about in the sort of internet sphere. But judge it according to your own bloods and your own sort of medical conditions. And if you do have fears around thyroid hormone interference, then it might be something you want to tail back on. But for the most part, people can do with more greens in the diet, not less or mitigating it.
Yeah, some of the anti-oxalate people, I mean, they propose these interesting mechanisms and concerns, and I think allegedly one of their alleged concerns is that these compounds like precipitate in a more subtle way in other tissues, and they invoke the concept of subtle harm. It's like we tend to think about like these overt pathologic diagnoses, right? Like goiter or kidney stones, right? But what about like leading up to, and I eat oxalate containing foods, right? I love like nuts. I love, I eat spinach occasionally, but not like an extreme amount. I eat it occasionally. But yeah, what do you think about that? Like, do you think that there's possibly any merit to those concerns?
I wouldn't say so, unless like we're dealing with someone who is some sort of hyper absorber of oxalates from their diet. In the same way we've got people who are hypo and hyper absorbers of cholesterol from cholesterol containing foods. There's probably going to be some variation across the population, but in general, I wouldn't say that. The other thing is like, going back to what we were talking about with regards to two different populations of people, you've got the really sick and unhealthy that need to have this advice and actually start implementing this on a daily basis. But on the other side, you've got some ultra healthy people who perhaps are experiencing almost like the nocebo effect, where you're actually having a negative detrimental effect from what you believe about what you're putting in your body. If as soon as you start learning about endocrine disrupting chemicals, for example, or the impact of certain greens on oxalate levels, or the fact that your water needs to be purified to the nth degree because it's got all these different contaminants in, you start actually experiencing some of those symptoms, and it's a phenomenon that I'm seeing actually quite a bit, and I think that can be perpetuated by certain voices on the internet and stuff, perhaps not in a way that they intended, but certainly as it's being received as well. And I think the other thing that I think we've all been privy to the Dunning-Kruger effect, which is like where you learn a little bit and you feel like, oh wow, I'm pretty much an expert on this subject. And then the more you dig, the more you learn. You're like, oh my god, there's like literally nothing that I know about this subject. Cholesterol was one of them. When I graduated from med school and I had cardiology as a placement, I thought I knew everything there was to know about cholesterol and cholesterol lowering diets and statins and all the rest of it. And actually you dig a little bit deeper and you're like, wow, this is fantastically complicated
Hmm.
and so diverse in terms of like how everyone is individually responding to cholesterol containing foods or have their own genetic variations that lead to high amounts and low amounts in their body. And so, yeah, it's, just one of those things that I feel a lot of people are experiencing live on the internet for everyone to sort of experience with them. You're like, oh, this guy sounds like he's really confident and really knows what he's talking about. And actually, they're just at the top of that Dunning-Kruger curve.
Dude, the Dunning-Kruger effect. Yeah, it's like a collective thing that you see on the internet. Particularly now with the ubiquity of like, and the saturation of like health information on social media.
Yeah. And I think it's sort of like in full swing on TikTok. Not that I spend much time on TikTok myself, but certainly from what people are sharing with me, and they're like, oh, I saw this on TikTok. What do you think? And I'm like, oh, well, I think this person is sort of like learning in real time. They're like building the plane in real time. So, they'll probably find out in a couple of years that they're very wrong. And
you don't want to fly that plane.
No, you definitely don't want to be a passenger on that plane either.
Oh my God. But it is funny that even medical doctors, even like credentialed healthcare professionals can succumb to the Dunning-Kruger effect.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And like as someone who is a general practitioner, so you guys call them family physicians, for example, we are tasked with learning a little bit about everything. And actually through that experience and engaging with people who are specialists in ENT, cardiology, gastroenterology, I almost have like this innate understanding of how little I know. And the fact that my sort of profession is to understand enough to be confident and safe in a certain specialty, all while understanding that there is a lot that I don't know and a lot that I need to rely on someone else for. And so I think that sort of general perspective and general understanding that I've always had has sort of kept me away from overstepping the mark, even when it comes to nutrition. I'm under no illusion that just because I've been in the field for 10 plus years and general practice, and I've had experience with patients, and I'm doing my nutritional medicine masters, that I'm somehow an expert in the subject. Even when people describe me as an expert, always makes me feel like a little bit cringe, because what I would describe myself as is well read. But I think, even when I'm well into my 60s and 70s, I'm probably never going to be an expert, because I just feel that there's so much one can learn about a particular subject, and it can be as nuanced as you like and as small and niche. But, I'm always going to be at the tip of like knowing just enough and never really getting there.
Yeah, I feel the same way. I mean, I've never called myself an expert. I've been called it. But it does always make me cringe, because I feel like I'm a student. I'm a perennial student of nutrition and learning and correcting my prior assumptions and my, and whatever beliefs I hold and biases and whatever. And that's in fact part of the fun. That's part of what I love so much about this field. And in fact, when people do call themselves experts, I cringe there as well. Even if they are what most people would describe as a nutrition expert, because I'm like, oh, so you know everything about every micronutrient?
Totally.
Or what are we talking about here? I just think that it's such hubris, to use a word like that. For such a complicated, complex field for which we are still learning. We still have so much to learn. I mean, talk about, and also nutrition science is a very difficult science, man. It's like an applied science for one.
Totally, yeah.
And there's so much to learn, about like bioindividuality and nutrigenomics. I mean, we are just at the very tip of the iceberg.
Yeah, and I'm really excited for that field, actually. I know you've had Tim on your pod before, and there's a whole bunch of companies in this space trying to decipher people's individual responses to food. And I think over the next few years, that's going to become paramount, because how we respond to food is going to be very different. I mean, the fact that I'm of Asian descent will mean that, I'm probably more likely to fare better on a vegetarian or a vegan diet than perhaps my Caucasian counterparts, Conversely, if I was to have more fat in my diet, perhaps that would put me at more risk of cardiovascular disease or even type 2 diabetes for a variety of factors as well. So the intervariability between different people based on their genetic inheritances, is going to come to light. And I think these companies are probably going to provide a lot more on that, as well as the impact on pharmacotherapy as well. Like the fact that I blanket prescribe antihypertensives to everyone based on the numbers that they're displaying in clinic or whatever, or ones that we've measured through ambulatory blood pressure monitoring at home, kind of baffles me, because we know already today that people are going to respond to different antihypertensive differently. And so being more refined in how we prescribe drugs and how we prescribe diets is going to become, I think, a real big thing in the future. All the while acknowledging the fact that even if I was to prescribe a diet, it's very hard to implement and maintain that diet as well. And so that's one of the things I think, within the digital company that I'm trying to create here, it's going to provide that implementation piece a little bit better.
What's the name of the company?
The Doctor's Kitchen app.
Oh, I love it. Amazing.
So the app today is it's essentially MVP. We bootstrapped it. We launched it at the start of last year. And right now you can find a selection of recipes that you can filter according to health goals. So me and my research team, we go through all the nutrition literature and we look at ingredients and dietary patterns that align with different health goals: cardiovascular health, mental well-being, inflammation. We use like validated diet scores like the DII, the Dietary Inflammation Index, for example. We use like a Mediterranean diet score, the Healthy Eating Index, for example. But in the future, the missing piece really is auto-generating a meal plan in the click of a couple of buttons that can suit your dietary preferences, the preferences of your kids, for example, your partner. It can appreciate the fact that, you might have this particular health goal, your partner might be doing a marathon, and creating a shopping list for you that at the click of a button you could send to an online grocer and have all your meals delivered to you within the budgetary constraint of your household. So again, it applies that food as medicine science with the ease and simplicity of essentially having what's like a digital meal kit. And that's the sort of thing that we're trying to crack at the moment, because I think, particularly as someone who would love to prescribe a diet, I'm very much attuned to how difficult it would be for someone to go to the supermarket, figure out what's good for their brain, buy all those ingredients, figure out how to put them together in a meal that everyone's going to love, all the while making sure that it's within the budgets that particular household has. It's a very complex thing. And so I think there's a real piece for machine learning, also known as AI. I don't want to say the AI word, but machine learning to essentially improve the solutions to that problem that everyone has.
Yeah. I've arrived at a place where I think if your diet has a name, you probably shouldn't be on it. Like diets shouldn't be brands.
Yeah.
And the minute you adhere to a diet with a name, you're almost like contractually obligated to that paradigm.
Yeah.
And like diets are not contracts, like try things, iterate. I mean, for a while I was like eating a diet that like, you might consider paleo-esque, but with legumes. Like I love legumes.
Yeah.
And but it's not a paleo diet technically.
Yeah. That's a really good point, actually. I've never really thought about diets as brands, I guess, but you're right. And actually, because like what you eat, there is such a visceral connection to it. It's almost like, religious like. And I think you've probably seen this online as well with particular movements. Like if you veer away from it or you haven't been successful in the diet, it's not because of the diet, it's because of you. You haven't been compliant to it, or, you haven't invested enough interest in it. And, I think that can be very restrictive for a lot of people. And actually, what you were mentioning, legumes, that's actually one of the ingredients that I was going to say at the top of this as well, in terms of what I would recommend for people when it comes to glucose spikes and weight maintenance as well. I actually did a recent solo podcast episode on glucose spikes, and I looked through some common strategies and hacks that people are using, like Jesse and Giuseppe, for example, who's done a great number of books and lots of topics on this, lots of information on this topic. And the research isn't particularly solid because there haven't been too many of these RCTs, but I think it's interesting enough for people to at least experiment with on a one-to-one basis. So legumes, fantastic. Not only are they good for your microbiota, ensuring that they have lots of interesting different pieces of fibrous materials to eat, creating those short chain fatty acids that we know nourish the colon, nourish your cells, improve inflammation, communicate with your brain via neurotransmitters indirectly and indirectly as well. But they also delay gastric emptying, and that can actually lead to a more measured glucose uptake into your bloodstream as well. So, fibers, you can look at them from multiple different angles, but overall, eating more legumes in your diet, I think, could be a good thing. The one thing I would say is that if people aren't used to having when I say legumes, I'm talking about chickpeas, beans, lentils, those sorts of things that you find in pods. The one thing is, if you're not used to eating legumes, it's definitely something you have to go very slow with, because you'll know about it and everyone else will know about it if you just start having 100 grams of cooked legumes every day, which is something I think people should aspire to go toward.
100 grams. I don't. What is that? That's like roughly 4 ounces.
Yeah, I would say that as a
Something like
minimum. Yeah, there was some recent studies looking at cardiovascular disease risk, and they found that people who ate 100 grams, I'm not too sure what it is in cups, but 100 grams of cooked legumes 4 times a week had a significant reduction in their cardiovascular risk, and reduction of their total cholesterol, even though I don't like looking at total cholesterol, LDL-C, by around 15%. So not as much as a typical low-dose statin, but still pretty good. So yeah.
I mean, legumes are great because they contain both fiber and protein.
Yeah, exactly, to varying amounts. And people like to dissect them according to like insoluble and soluble fiber. The reality is most of your plant-based ingredients will contain both, but different variations, different ratios. So, your legumes are going to have more insoluble fibers, but they also have, like you said, like plenty of protein and plenty of fiber as well. And this whole protein argument for having more protein in a diet, I think overall in the UK we are probably protein replete, but it's probably the quality of where we get those proteins. We tend to get them mainly from processed meats and other sources that don't have the fiber contained in them as well. But really, when you're looking at high quality proteins from legumes and some animal products as well, these are things that we should be focusing our diet around.
Definitely. I found it actually pretty difficult to be. We're recording this in case you're just tuning in from London. I'm in London, and I found it pretty difficult to get unprocessed, lean-ish meat that's not drenched in sauces and or fried. It's proven to be pretty difficult. I mean, I've gone to I told you before we started rolling, steakhouses like for most of my meals here.
Yeah.
Because it's hard to find. Like at breakfast, it's a lot of like processed meats, a lot of sausages.
Yeah.
Which a lot of people will think of, look at a sausage and think, oh, that's a protein food.
Yeah.
It's actually mostly a fat food.
Yeah.
It's a lot of fat in a sausage, and who knows what else. And same with like bacon, which, is like replete at the breakfast bar at the hotel that I'm staying in. But in the UK, it's pretty hard to find. And I'm a huge fan of unprocessed red meat and chicken breast and fish and all that stuff. But I found it pretty difficult to find.
Yeah. A lot of people who say that, we don't have that much processed meat in the UK. I think a mistaken actually. A lot of where the protein comes from in the UK diet is a lot of processed food. So, like you were just mentioning, the bacon and sausages, those are regular items on the hospital breakfast menu.
Wow.
Where I, work, and every hospital I've ever worked at has always had eggs, beans. Beans are not bad, but they're covered in like a sugary tomato sauce. But like eggs, beans, and sausages in the morning with your fried hash brown and maybe some fried bread as well.
What is the deal with like barbecued baked beans at breakfast for Brits? What? How are you supposed to? How do you eat that?
So it's not barbecue beans. It's a tomato sauce with sugar in it. So it's not. It doesn't sound very appetizing, but it is an absolute staple in the UK. And you won't get many fans if you start slating Heinz beans, for example, in the UK. Like we freaking love it. But they do have versions now with like low sugar and all the rest of it.
But
so
how
it's
do you
less
eat it?
processed. You literally eat it on the side. So you haven't had a full English.
No.
Oh man. All right, we're gonna have to
Yeah.
as part of your sort of like introduction into British culture, we're gonna have to give you a fry up. And you're just gonna have to put everything that we talked about up to this point about the dangers of processed foods and all the additives and all the excessive additive. You just have to put that to one side and just enjoy a fry up. So it's beans on. Think of a big plate. You've got beans on one side. You've got like 2 sausages that are probably very minimally pork. It's mainly rusk and
What's rusk?
Rusk is like it's the equivalent of sawdust. It's like literally there's nothing in it. It's it's just like whatever sort of refined carb that you put into a sausage to bulk it out.
Is it like wheat?
It's not great. I'm not saying this is healthy at all. And then whatever fats they've found, in the slaughterhouse, they would just put it in this. And then you have your bacon, which has obviously got loads of processed, nitrites in and all the rest of it. Not very good for you at all. And then you have a fried egg that's got way too much oil in, and you put all that other, if you could finish a fry up, I'd be pretty impressed.
I don't know. That sounds like a challenge that I'm willing to take on. So it's like, and the egg and the yolk and the beans mixed together. And it sounds really tasty.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not really selling it that much, but
it sounds good though.
Yeah, a good breakfast, a good English fry up is actually very good. With proper sausages and proper bacon and eggs and all the rest of it. But I'm saying that like I've recently. Not that I'm naming my diet, but I've basically gone pescatarian recently. Actually,
what were you prior?
I ate everything apart from foie gras. So I just don't like the process of foie gras.
Same.
When you've seen it, the videos and stuff, you're like, I don't think I could do that. And the meat that I was consuming was from the local butchers, and they could name the farmer that they have a relationship with. And the same with the fishmonger as well. Now the only time I eat fish or any animal products are when I know where it's come from, and I'm in a privileged position where I can actually do that. But yeah, no, I've gone pescatarian over the last couple of months, and I feel a lot lighter in myself. The reason why I went pescatarian is because I have a dog. It's 3 years old, and she just reminds me so much of a lamb. She's tiny, and she like hops and skips around like a little lamb in the field. And like when you've just got that connection, and sometimes you just can't disassociate the two. And even though I know like a lot of people in my family, they still eat meat and all the rest of it. I've eaten meat for years, and I don't think there's anything ethically wrong, particularly if you're in a position where you can actually butcher and kill your own meat. I think that's a fantastic thing to do. You have that real visceral connection with your food that we've lost over the last few decades. For me, it's just kind of, I've lost that. So I'm pescatarian at the moment. And I'm enjoying it. I'm actually really enjoying it. I don't really miss the steaks.
I respect that a lot. And also, for somebody who talks about food professionally, I respect your ability to pivot.
Thanks, man.
Publicly. Yeah. I think that's very cool.
It's taken a little while, I think, just to get over the hump of like,
Just don't go and start making like crazy health claims. Anti-meat health claims.
Exactly. No. That's the thing. Like, whatever my diet, even if I was like fully plant-based, for example, like a lot of my colleagues, I don't think I would ever. And the plant-based colleagues that I respect the most are people who are willing to say it's okay if you want to have a meat in your diet. It's okay, and everyone has variations on it. Some people, and I've had patients who can't tolerate things like legumes. People who are celiac, for example, with wheat, obviously. These are the types of people for whom getting adequate and good quality nutrients in the diet is going to be very, very difficult. So to put them on a restrictive diet, I think, is a wrong thing to suggest. And the sort of health risks associated with meat in your diet, I think, is not going to be a useful thing to talk to those kind of people about, which is why I'm pretty agnostic when it comes to dietary paradigms. It really depends on the individual.
Yeah. I mean, I got to be honest, I've been traveling, and the healthiest food that I'm regularly able to consistently find is steak.
Yeah.
like lean, grilled. Because like in an industrially farmed animal, for an industrially farmed animal, there is an argument to be made, I think, for opting for leaner meat. I think it's, you know, fat is stored in toxins. The fatty acid profile of industrially raised meat is not ideal because it's being fed a biologically inappropriate diet. And when on the road, I mean, this is going to sound really privileged, but like I can go to a steakhouse and get a filet mignon,
Yeah.
which I'm paying a little bit more for, but it's lean. It's not fat free. I'm still
Yeah.
getting fat, you
Yeah.
know. So people are like, "Oh, Mac's on a fat free diet." No, it still contains fat, but it's like an amazing source of protein. It's not usually coming with a ton of added fat calories from oil because they don't use oil when they're grilling a steak. And then as a side, I try to get like whatever grilled vegetable I can find.
Yeah. And that actually is like a very healthy way of eating for all the people, right? Just like having lean meat and your vegetables on the side. And actually that as a strategy has worked for a lot of people that I know, and a lot of patients as well. They're just like, well, I just stick to that, and I've got the greens, and I've got my my lean meat. That I'm good. And actually, for a lot of people, that works.
Yeah, and to be honest, in the restaurant setting, it's the vegetables that tend to be coated with restaurant oil, and the salads that tend to have all the added calories that come from the industrial dressings, the commercial dressings that they're using.
Yeah.
In the restaurant setting, I've found that it's like, and you don't have to eat red meat. You could eat grilled fish, grilled chicken, or whatever, but it's like the grilled protein that's like often the healthiest option.
Yeah. Do you count calories at all, or you just
No.
like, literally just yeah.
I try to keep a tab, like a rough tab of how much protein I've had in the day.
Okay.
Yeah, because your boy's a bit of a meathead, kind of. No pun intended. But no, I like to, I strive to get an amount of protein that has been, determined as optimal to support muscle protein synthesis and optimize the effort that I put in the gym. So I'm trying to hit my my macros every day.
Yeah. From my perspective, like I feel like I always hit the amount of protein that I need for my daily requirements, and I'm always looking at the amount of vegetables on my plate because we need to get upwards of 9 to 10 portions of fruit and vegetables per day. There was some recent study at the Imperial College of London, which is where I went to med school, probably 2019, I think it was published, where they looked at the optimum amount of fruit and vegetables that correlates with the lowest risk of all-cause mortality. And they found that actually 5 a day was the bare minimum, and actually we need to get close to 10 a day. And that, there's a whole bunch of reasons as to why that might be the case. Maybe it's the lack of fiber that we have in our vegetables today, or maybe it's the loss of nutrients, and all these sort of like hypotheses as to why we suddenly need like this massive amount of vegetables on our plates these days. I can't really speak to that, but that's made me very conscious about how much vegetables I have on my plates, alongside obviously the proteins and all the rest of it. So it also can your portions a day, which is 80 grams. I'm not too sure how much that is in cups for Americans, but 80 grams of fruit or vegetable is one portion, and so we need to get close to almost a kilogram of fruits and vegetables per day to meet that like 10 a day requirement. So I'm always looking at, okay, how can I add like 1 or 2 more vegetables to my plate? Can I get legumes in? Can I get some more onions and that kind of stuff?
Yeah, I mean, as I've been traveling, one food that's been a staple for me have been macadamia nuts.
Oh yeah?
Yeah, and I'm sponsored, like the show is sponsored in part by House of Macadamias.
Oh,
but they make these delicious. Yeah, how's that for a subtle?
That's a nice little segue.
Nice little subtle segue. But no, House of Macadamias, they make these incredible dry roasted macadamias, and they're super easy to like throw in your backpack.
Sweet.
And these count as a plant, right? Do they not?
Yeah. So I count nuts and seeds as one of those fruits and vegetables. Technically, they're not, because arbitrarily they're just not. But actually, I think nuts and seeds should, because they contain magnesium, vitamin E, zinc, all these really important micronutrients that are quite hard to find in other sorts of fruits and vegetables. So I would definitely
they're bomb.
Those.
They're bomb. They're like, they don't add any oils. They're dry roasted, and the flavors are like 10 out of 10.
Yeah.
sea salt. You got like salsa, onion. They've got like some dipped varieties. Really, really good.
Yeah, I'm a sucker for the ones that are dipped in like dark chocolate, that kind
Yeah,
of stuff.
those definitely veer towards the hyper palatable
Yeah,
side
yeah,
of the
yeah, yeah,
continuum,
yeah,
where
for
it's like,
sure.
okay, gotta pump the brakes a
I'm
little bit.
I'm yeah, I'm a sucker for those kind of things. Like my wife has to constantly stop me from raiding the cupboards because, if there are like some chocolate covered almonds or macadamia nuts in this case, I just yeah, I can't stop myself. So I can't actually keep snacks in the house. I can only keep them outside and enjoy them outside because I would just go through the whole lot.
Yeah, I love it.
Yeah.
You gotta impose some form of restraint today.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And this like restriction and like maintaining sort of, that's what I was asking about calories actually, because I think for a lot of people it can actually be a good thing, but it really depends on the person. And so this whole like idea of like guilt and restriction as being a bad thing, you should never have any guilt, you should never have restriction. I don't agree with that at all. I actually think it's quite healthy to experience the emotion of guilt, because what that does is it creates some boundaries. Like I should feel guilty if I'm a dick to my wife, for example. If we get into an argument and it's my fault, the reason why we experience guilt is so I don't maintain that habit and that doesn't happen again. It's when guilt or restriction spirals into shame that leads to that real negative place where you can't eat, in this case, for example, and it disrupts a normal relationship with food. That's what we need to be careful of, but not guilt and restriction itself. I think those are normal human emotions that we should experience. And so this whole sort of idea of never having a guilty moment with food or never having a restricted moment with food, I think is actually kind of damaging. And yeah, just as an aside, I think people need to be aware of, yes, the spiraling effect, but not necessarily a normal human emotion.
Yeah, there is no bad emotion.
No, there isn't. They're just emotions, and it's how we deal with them. And I think actually what you're doing by saying, oh, you can never have that emotion, is actually removing the ability to tolerate those, removing that resilience factor. And if we go around our world, removing ourselves from environments where we can be triggered, then we lose sort of the connection with the real world, because the reality is wherever we are, we're going to be experiencing bad things. And actually growth is part of experiencing that, reflecting on it, and doing better next time.
Absolutely, I love that. So imposing a bit of restraint today, you would say, is actually like it's like having a healthy relationship with food and being able to put parameters in place that don't cause you to overeat your indulgence foods. Actually, they're not mutually exclusive concepts.
Yeah, I mean, like one of the things that I like to sort of weigh in with patients about is this idea of time restricted feeding, also known as intermittent fasting, although that's quite a vague term. And I think a nice way to dip your toe into it is actually just put a 12-hour fasting window and a 12-hour feeding window in. And what that, generally means is you start at 8 a.m. and you stop at 8 p.m. Eating. And that's actually very achievable for a lot of people. And inadvertently, let's say you won't have all those beneficial effects of upregulating autophagy, even though there's no way for us to measure that, or like imposing a bit of gut rest, so it improves your gut metabolism and gives your microbes a rest, and you reduce the amount of time whereby your tight junctions are widened, thus leaking the components in your digestive tract into your bloodstream. But let's say like none of that stuff happens. What it does is it prevents you from eating chips or ice cream later in the evening that can disrupt your sleep and lead to a vicious cycle the next day where you feel more of a craving for the salty, sweet foods, So like actually having that restriction, if you want to describe it like that, is beneficial because it's actually encouraging those healthier behaviors.
Hey, if you like that video, you need to check out this one here, and I'll see you there.